Welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. For those who are not familiar with our organization, we are a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender direct action group. We believe that that it's actually activity of people in the streets of our cities that actually makes for real change. And while we focus on so-called LGBT issues for our activities, we also are not a single issue organization. We understand that we live in a wider world where issues of war and peace and budget cutbacks and other things directly affect our ability to be active in the world and get the sort of rights that we need. And along those lines, we're going to be talking tonight, as you saw on your screen, about NATO. And there's been a lot of news lately here in the city about the NATO summits coming to Chicago. But we want to talk about the real issues, and that is why people should oppose NATO. There's been a lot of stuff about permits and all that sort of stuff. You can read about that in the press. But we are very honored to have really Chicago's premier NATO specialist, Rick Rozoff, with us here tonight of the Stop NATO website. And Rick, it's a genuine pleasure to have you here tonight. Rick, if I was going to ask for a 30-second question, why should you oppose NATO, what would be your answer?
Well, first I'm going to thank you in return for having me on the show. And on a previous show on another program, Andy, you referred to me as a NATO specialist. And after the fact, I thought about it, and I said, well, I'm a NATO specialist in the sense that an infectious disease physician is an expert on typhus or typhoid or malaria or something that is, I know more than I choose to know about it. Mm-hmm. And I welcome the day where none of us have to even discuss this issue. But in the meantime, the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which initially was founded by major Western military powers that have borders with the Atlantic Ocean, the North Atlantic Ocean, has now expanded from 16 members in 1991, at the time where the Soviet Union, collapsed, and the Warsaw Pact, which had been fairly well moribund for years around that time, dissolved itself. And that from 1999 to 2009, NATO expanded from 16 members to 28 members. That's a 75% increase.
But why should we oppose it, Rick? What's the, if you're going to give me a encapsulation, what's wrong with NATO, and why should people be upset that NATO's coming to Chicago in May?
Yeah, NATO's the only military bloc in the world. We have to be clear about it. However, it tries to portray itself. Otherwise, it is at heart and at bottom a military organization. It is one that has waged military campaigns over the last 13 years in 3 different continents. In southeastern Europe, in South Asia, and Afghanistan, increasingly spilling over into Pakistan, in North Africa and Libya last year. It is an aggressive, arbitrary, unelected, unaccountable military bloc. It is not only the only one in the world, it's the largest one in history, and it's one that is is a threat to world peace. It's a threat to international law. It's a threat to the United Nations, which in many ways it tries to not only circumvent but supplant and ultimately replace. To the extent we oppose war and to the extent we oppose military aggression and obscene military budgets and so forth, no greater embodiment of that threat is exists than the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yeah, which is responsible for some 70% of world military spending, and we just got the news out just a few days ago by the Committee for Investigative Journalism that the drone attacks on Yemen, which, the United States, I don't know if that would be considered under the NATO umbrella, but certainly the United States is the 500-pound gorilla within NATO. The drone attacks in Yemen have now reached the same level as they have in Pakistan. And anyone who knows about what's going on in Pakistan and how bitterly resentful the people of Pakistan are against the United States for these drone attacks knows that they're replicating the same thing in Yemen, where we've had a dictator supported by the United States through plenty of military spending. And so the United States, when it goes around preaching about the internal affairs of Iran or other nations, you have to look no farther than the kind of regimes that the United States and NATO support, whether it's the Saudi Arabian dictatorship, which sent troops and tanks into neighboring Bahrain to militarily crush the Bahrain democracy movement. I mean, that was the sort of thing that we allegedly went to war against Saddam Hussein in the first U.S.-Iraq war. And here we have the United States supporting the Saudi dictatorship. But I guess my question, Rick, is you mentioned Southeastern Europe, you mentioned other areas of the globe. Are there any figures on just how many people have been killed thanks to NATO action? Is that data available anyplace?
It's rather difficult to compile. We can estimate, a minimum of say 10,000 people killed in Afghanistan over the 11-year war. Now it's actually in its 12th calendar year,
right?
Which is the longest war in America's history. It is fought technically under the auspices of the International Security Assistance Force, which is commanded by NATO. So what we're talking about is the longest war in America's history is now being conducted half a world away in South Asia. It's one that has displaced several 100,000 people, has killed, a minimum of 10,000, probably several tens of thousands of Afghan civilians in addition to fighters. And when we protest NATO on March 20th and May 20th and May 21st, we have to recall that, Afghanistan is really the prototype or the model that NATO has now created for international military interventions, and we can see what a bloody debacle it has turned out to be. It is one that has not benefited the Afghan people. There's no more stability. Arguably, there's less in the country now than there was on October 7th, 2001, when the first U.S. and British soldiers went in and NATO followed them shortly thereafter. As you mentioned, about Yemen, we can also talk about deadly drone attacks in Somalia. Yes. Where the U.S. is now conducting, I called it the decade of the drone in an article I wrote 3 years ago, that, modern warfare conducted by the United States and its Western allies increasingly is rather cowardly and operated from a distance, as with the drone attacks. But there's also, as of the last 3 years, a permanent NATO naval operation off the Horn of Africa in the Gulf of Aden, called Operation Ocean Shield, which just in the last 2 weeks has been extended for an additional 2 years to 2014. There has been since 2011, October of 2011, a what now permanent naval surveillance and monitoring naval operation in the Mediterranean called Operation Ocean Shield. So in fact, what you're talking about is an international military purview. You've got, again, a U.S.-dominated military alliance that has not been authorized by the United Nations or anybody else to conduct these sorts of global military operations, and they are in fact resulting in the deaths, of tens if not hundreds of thousands of people. There have been estimates as high as 30,000 people killed by NATO bombings in Libya last year. Thousands were killed in the Balkans. Last week was very interesting, incidentally. And it has just happened that within 1 week there were 3 anniversaries that ordinarily don't fall that way on the calendar. They were the anniversary, March 24th, of NATO's war against Yugoslavia in 1999. May 20th was the anniversary. March 20th was the anniversary of the beginning of the war against Iraq in 2003, and March 19th was the first anniversary of the war by the U.S. Africa Command and NATO against Libya, so that within 1 week you had 3 anniversaries of 3 wars that have been conducted within a 12-year period. So this is the scope, and we're living in a war, in an era, Andy, really
Endless war.
Endless war. It's a permanent war condition, and it's one that could affect any part of the world or any nation in the world any day.
And as a longtime anti-war activist, this is something that flabbergasts me in terms of young people growing up. They've known nothing but a country at war, and that war is being secreted over to the United States. When you look at the fact that so-called security spending in this country has doubled since 2001. It has domestic effects. You can't have empire abroad without having attacks on civil liberties, attacks on people at home. Before we rejoin our conversation with Rick Rozoff of Stop NATO, just wanted to call your attention to a few important announcements. If you want to get in touch with the Gay Liberation Network, please check out our website at www.gayliberation.net. And as Rick mentioned, there are going to be protests this May against the NATO summit in Chicago. Go to that website, www.cang8.org, to get more information about that. And we are committed to a Sunday, May 20th, 12 noon protest in downtown Chicago. Yes, if you've been following the press, there are things going on with the city, shall we say, regarding permits, but we are committed to a peaceful, nonviolent, family-friendly protest on Sunday, May 20th, 12 noon, starting in downtown Chicago, marching to the site of the summits at McCormick Place. And I'd also like to make note of an invitation to Mayor Rahm Emanuel that we issued today during our press conference. We're inviting Rahm Emanuel to have a debate with us about should Chicago support NATO. As Rick mentioned, the mayor brought the totally undemocratic NATO, totally unaccountable NATO to our city, and as far as we can tell, only 2 people supported it. One Mayor Rahm Emanuel and one President Barack Obama. So we encourage our watchers to call City Hall at 312-744-5000 and issue an appeal to our mayor to join the debate. And then, of course, you want to really check out why you should oppose NATO. Check out Rick's website, Rick Rozoff at WordPress.com, and he'll get you all hooked up with all sorts of very important information that we don't have time to deal with tonight. Now, Rick, you mentioned that this has been going on, America's longest war in Afghanistan, we're in the 12th year now. What has been the difference in the attitudes of NATO from Democratic Party administrations versus Republican administrations? We're in election here, and NATO's summit here in Chicago is seen by many as President Obama's great opportunity to look presidential, whatever that means, in the run-up to his ostensible re-election. So the question becomes, has NATO been any better under the Democratic Party versus the Republicans, whether under this president or President Clinton or others?
You know, truthfully, no. I mean, the old saw that political differences end at the shoreline has never been truer than when it applies to NATO. The current State Department spokesperson, Victoria Nuland, in the Obama State Department, is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO under the George W. Bush administration. So you have these sorts of elites that come in and out of think tanks. The current U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalder, for example, is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, on leave to fulfill that role. He's also born in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. So, behind the governments, which are democratic in name and sometimes in form in Western Europe as well as the United States, you have, again, unelected, unaccountable individuals who, fill in slots with various administrations, Democratic and Republican, don't seem to matter much. And with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it was actually set up, of course, under the auspices of a Democratic administration, that of Harry Truman. But the first Supreme Allied Commander in Europe for NATO was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would go on to become, the Republican successor to Truman. So there's really no difference on that score. On domestic issues, of course, there are. On how certain other types of foreign policy issues are handled, there are differences, sometimes substantial. But on the question of using NATO as an international military force, or even if some of your viewers are familiar with this YouTube video of Defense Secretary Leon Panetta a few days ago testifying before the Senate Armed Forces Committee, and when asked if presumably in relation to a prospective attack against Syria, Iran, or both, if he would seek the authorization of the U.S. Congress beforehand, he said, well, if we had the authorization of NATO and other international bodies, essentially Congress be damned, we don't need them. There's another objection to NATO is that it really does override the U.S. Constitution, congressional monitoring, the war power resolution, which has effectively been killed as a result of last year's NATO war against Libya.
Right, and that was done, of course, by Barack Obama. And the War Powers Act, is my layman's understanding, is that they have, was it 30 days or is it 60 days in order to get authorization from Congress for an ongoing military adventure. And of course, Barack Obama just thumbed his nose to that, as he has frankly thumbed his nose to any number of other constitutional prohibitions, such as doing away with habeas corpus, which was the great offense of the National Defense Authorization Act, which I think we have to see these attacks on civil liberties is part and parcel of what NATO is about. And it's very interesting. Before we went on the air, Rick was telling me about all these NATO partners, some 70 NATO partners, so-called. I mean, NATO has got a formal membership. It sounds like something, for those of us who have had a little bit of reading in classical history, it sounds like almost like the old Roman Empire, where you've got various gradations of nations and leaders that are tributaries to, and these so-called non-great nations pay tribute to the United States through offering bases and other favors. And it is amazing the arrogance of a country calling itself democratic or a republic. Has the Roman Empire taken over already?
No, you put that amazingly well. I was thinking of a far less erudite illusion, which is the board game Risk, where one takes over continent by continent until you dominate the entire globe. And I think, just a couple of days ago, Andy, on the NATO website, they announced that evidently, this got under my radar, in April of last year in Berlin, NATO instituted a new partnership program called Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program. And the first member of that, it was announced a couple of days ago, is Mongolia. Now, Mongolia is a very interesting country. It's one of only 3 that borders both China and Russia simultaneously.
Right.
Another is Kazakhstan, which is the only country outside of Europe, if you include the South Caucasus, that has what NATO calls an Individual Partnership Action Program, which is an advanced NATO integration program.
And in Kazakhstan, haven't they been instrumental in helping supply the Afghanistan war?
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, a couple of years ago, the now American ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, when he was still on the National Security Council, Obama's National Security Council, announced that cargo planes would leave Chicago, fly over the Arctic Ocean, and then presumably over either Russia or China into Kazakhstan as part of the new supply route for the war in Afghanistan. So, even the Arctic Ocean is not immune to NATO penetration, evidently, at this point. But yes, there are 28 full members of NATO. There are, by their own count, NATO's own account, 42 partners in Africa, in Asia, in Oceania, South Pacific, Far East Asia, and so forth, the Middle East. And so that you have almost half of the countries in the world, again, as I mentioned, who are affiliated in some way. And you're absolutely correct. Let's use the language used by Zbigniew Brzezinski. NATO has allies, members.
Tell people who Brzezinski
was. A former national security advisor for the Carter administration, but somebody who, in 1991, my dentist, when he was extracting a wisdom tooth from me, said, "That devil Brzezinski." And I can't improve on that characterization of it. But, he's a self-styled geostrategist who is interested in maintaining, Western control of the world in the post-Cold War period. But we have a situation, I would use the words along the lines of what you're saying, Andy, and they're from Brzezinski's 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, where he says,
and we're all just pawns.
Yeah, the West and the Allies have vassals and tributaries.
That's it. Yeah.
So Eastern European, Southern European countries, and so forth, are just that, vassals and tributaries.
Yeah. Well, and we've got a situation now. I can only imagine how citizens of Europe, for example, feel? I referred to the NATO being the 800, the United States being the 800-pound gorilla within NATO. How do people in Europe feel, basically being dragooned into one American war after another? There's this great rivalry on one level, not just between the United States and China over oil resources, but arguably the U.S. Gulf War against Saddam Hussein, the two Gulf Wars, were in large part shot across the bow, not just of China, but frankly Europe, as to who would control the world's oil resources, informally, if we will. And yet, European troops, European resources are being dragooned into this war of empire that fortunately the vast majority of Europeans reject. And now I'm happy to say, thanks to efforts of the anti-war movement in this country, the majority of Americans reject America's longest war. I mean, the feelings of resentment towards NATO must be immense in Europe.
They are, but unfortunately, part of the NATO accession process, part of going through various stages of integration before you become a full NATO member, include really the political purging, of nations. This happened particularly in Eastern Europe, where any political party, and this didn't necessarily have to be successors to the former communist parties in the country. It could even be conservative nationalists who still had some idea of their country's sovereignty and so forth. But across the board, anyone who politically didn't buy into the Western agenda, which is a U.S. agenda, both for the European continent and ultimately globally, were just purged. Oftentimes with overt and heavy-handed intervention by NATO Secretary General and others in that process, so that they've really so delimited the political process in NATO countries. They're told who they can buy arms from. They're told who they can have diplomatic relations with, and so forth. This is as much political, economic, and so forth as it is military.
Okay, we've got time for really just one more question here before we have to hit our closing, though, Rick. And what I'd like to say. It took the Visigoths to get rid of the Roman Empire. Do we have any Visigoths on our side to get rid of NATO? How do we get rid of NATO?
That's a fascinating question, and I think we may have seen them gather in New Delhi yesterday. I'm talking about the 4th annual BRICS meeting, heads of state meeting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which, by the way, was very firm, I think, on Russian and Chinese insistence on the question of no foreign military intervention in Syria, no military attack against Iran. Yeah, we can form an international coalition of people within countries and state to state alliances to demand we return to the United Nations, return to international law, no military solutions for economic or political problems.
Okay, and thank you very much. Rick Rozoff is our Chicago NATO expert, internationally known for his work on this, and we're really privileged to have him here in Chicago. Just a few closing announcements. Again, check out Rick's website at www.rickrozoff.com. You can find all sorts of important information there, and of course, you should check out the protests in Chicago that are going to be happening just in less than 2 months now. Go to www.cang8.org to get more information about that. And the protest that will be here in Chicago, I should say one of the protests, is going to be at 12 noon Sunday, May 20th, on the opening day of the summit, a march to the NATO summit down at McCormick Place, starting in downtown Chicago at 12 noon on that day. And again, join us in our debate invitation to Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And I'd really love to have Rick Rozoff on our side for that one. Badger the Mayor. He brought the NATO summit here to Chicago. I have yet to find any regular Chicagoan who supports this, so please call the mayor at that number at the bottom of your screen. And we want to call attention to our next GLN meeting. You want to get involved in our organization. It's the first Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. at the Burger Park Cultural Center, Wednesday, April 4th. And our next show here on CAN TV will be on Friday, April 13th. Same time, same channel. And then finally, we'd like to say a very hearty thank you to the people who helped put on tonight's show.